Right. So we're going deep today into genes and evolution with The Genetic Book of the Dead by Richard Dawkins.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So we're going to try and answer this pretty big question. Are genes just like blueprints, or are they like the driving force of evolution?
So like, are they just passive or are they actively making things happen?
Exactly. Like, imagine if you could store like the blueprint of life in granite for like 10,000 years. Is DNA more than just a molecule? What does it actually mean for a gene to be selfish?
That's a big question, and it's a debate that's been going on for a while.
Yeah, for sure.
Dawkins, he's obviously coming at it from the gene-centric view. Like, genes are the main characters in this whole evolution story.
Right.
But then you have people like Dennis Noble who see it differently, more from the organism's point of view.
So, like, the genes are just tools.
Yeah, basically.
Interesting. So it's like a scientific showdown.
It kind of is. Like, Dawkins even directly calls out Noble, says his idea that genes aren't active causes is totally wrong.
Oh, wow.
Dawkins thinks that for natural selection to even work, genes have to be making things happen.
Right. That makes sense.
And to explain this, he uses this really cool analogy with a church clock.
A church clock. Okay, I'm intrigued.
So think about it. To prove that something is a cause, you have to change it and see what happens, right?
You have to see the effect.
Exactly. So if you mess with the mechanism of a church clock, you directly change how it chimes.
So like the gears are the genes.
Kind of. Dawkins is saying mutations in genes are like those changes you make to the clock. They lead to changes you can actually see in organisms over generations.
Okay, I'm starting to see where he's going with this.
And here's the thing. Only the changes in your genes get passed down to your kids. Like, think about it.
Okay, yeah.
A scar, like if you hurt yourself or something, or even something you learned, your kids won't inherit that.
Right.
But a change in your genes, that's a whole different story. That gets passed on.
So Dawkins is showing how messing with genes directly changes organisms.
Yeah. He's highlighting how they're like active drivers of evolution.
Okay, so genes are more than just static blueprints. They're really impacting how evolution unfolds.
Yeah. And Dawkins takes it even further with this kind of mind-blowing idea of the immortal gene.
The immortal gene?
Yeah, so he asks us to imagine, like, carving the whole human genome into granite.
Ooh!
Huge, right? It would be massive.
Yeah.
But the information in that carving, theoretically, you could use it to create a clone even thousands of years later.
Wait, are you serious? Like, bring someone back from an inscription on a rock?
Well, hypothetically, we'd need the tech to, like, read and understand that code and, a woman to provide an egg and all that.
Right, of course.
But the point Dawkins is making is that the blueprint, the essence of a person, would still be there in the stone.
Wow, that's intense. It makes you think about how fragile life is, but also how resilient that information is.
Exactly. And it shows how powerful that replication process is.
So how does DNA achieve this immortality?
Well, think about those scribes in ancient times, like copying scrolls to preserve knowledge.
Okay, I'm with you.
DNA replication is similar. It uses enzymes, and they act like those careful scribes.
So they're the protectors of genetic information.
Yeah. But even those scribes sometimes made mistakes. Like, remember that thing about adding fasting to what Jesus said about prayer?
Yeah, I've heard that.
Well, sometimes those little errors happen in DNA too, and that's what we call mutations. And get this, they're like the fuel for evolution.
Whoa, okay, so we've got genes that are active, potentially immortal, and they can copy themselves. But how does this all tie into natural selection, survival of the fittest, all that?
Okay, so to explain that, Dawkins uses another analogy, this time with rowing.
Rowing.
Yeah, like the Oxford-Cambridge boat race.
Got it.
He compares the rowers to genes. They all work together, but each one is picked for how much they help the team win.
Oh, so genes are like athletes competing for a spot on the team.
Exactly. So a good gene is one that helps make bodies that survive and reproduce better.
Right. And this success is because of how they impact the organism, even though the environment obviously matters too.
Makes sense. But what about the whole idea that there's not a specific gene for, like, eye color or height?
Ah, good question. Dawkins talks about this directly. He says it's a misconception. He uses this image of a sheet hanging by, like, hundreds of strings. Each string is a gene.
So it's not just one gene for one trait.
Nope. If you pull on one string, the whole shape of the sheet changes.
So it's about how the genes all interact.
Yeah. They all work together to create what we call the phenotype, which is basically how the genes are expressed, like your eye color, height, all that.
So you're not looking for the intelligence gene, but how all the variations in the genes plus the environment work together.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a whole team, and the best genes are the ones that help the team survive and thrive.
Okay, so it's not a one-to-one relationship. It's more about how genes and the environment dance together. And this is where the idea of the extended phenotype comes in, right? You got it. Dawkins says that a gene's influence goes beyond the organism's body. The extended phenotype is all the effects a gene has on the world that then influence its chances of survival.
So like a beaver's dam or a bird's nest. They're not part of the animal, but they're built by it, and they definitely help it survive.
Exactly. Think of them like physical things that show the beaver's or bird's genes interacting with the world.
So it blurs the line between what's inside an organism and what's outside.
Totally. It shows how connected everything is and how genes can reach beyond the body to shape the environment and ultimately the chances of survival.
Wow, okay. So genes might be playing a much bigger role in the world than we thought. But before we go too far, let's talk more about this idea of the organism as a vehicle. What does that actually mean?
So Dawkins makes this important distinction between the vehicle, which is the organism, like you, me, that beaver, and the replicator, which is the gene. The organism does stuff, makes decisions, but it's the gene that lives on through generations.
So are we all just like fancy robots carrying around these little replicators?
It's a wild thought, isn't it? It leads to the idea that maybe organisms evolved as, like, sophisticated robots to protect and spread the genes they carry.
Mind blown. So are we just vessels for our genes? Are we just survival machines? What does that mean for who we are as individuals?
Now, those are some big philosophical questions. We're just scratching the surface here, but I think it's important to remember that genes aren't alone. They interact with each other and the environment to create an organism. And that organism, with its experiences, its consciousness, is more than just its genes.
So we're more than the ingredients in the recipe. We're the finished dish.
Exactly. We're not just passive products of our genes. We interact with the world and shape our own lives. It's not about individual organisms being selfless. It's more about the genes promoting stuff that helps them survive, even if it looks like the organism is being altruistic.
Oh, so like acts of selflessness are actually just genes playing the long game.
Right. Remember, genes share copies of themselves with relatives. So a gene that makes an organism help its family could actually be helping copies of itself in those relatives survive. It's called inclusive fitness.
Hold on. Inclusive fitness. What's that?
It means a gene's success isn't just about it surviving. It's also about copies of it in relatives surviving. It's like a whole family thing for genes.
Okay, that makes sense. Helping family helps the genes. But what about cooperation between individuals who aren't related? Surely genes aren't pushing for just random acts of kindness.
Well, not exactly random, but yeah, there are times when unrelated individuals cooperating can benefit the genes. This is where things get really interesting. One idea is reciprocal altruism.
Reciprocal altruism. I think I've heard of that. Is it like you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours?
Exactly. It's the idea that organisms might cooperate because they expect to benefit later.
But wouldn't that take a lot of brain power? Like keeping track of who helped them and who they owe favor to.
That's what's so cool. Dawkins says that even simple things could lead to reciprocal altruism evolving, like just a tendency to do things again that were rewarded before could be enough.
So even without thinking about it, organisms can evolve to cooperate.
Yeah, it shows how looking at things from the gene's point of view can explain complicated behaviors with simple mechanisms.
Okay, so we're seeing how selfish genes can actually explain cooperation and altruism. But I'm still thinking about this whole immortal gene thing. If that's true, what does it mean for us as individuals? Where do we fit in?
That's a deep question. People have been thinking about that for ages. From a purely gene-centric view, our identities might seem temporary. We are just vehicles for these replicators after all.
Like we're just small parts in the big story of genes.
Well, not exactly. Remember, genes don't exist alone. They interact with each other and the environment to create an organism. And that organism, with its experiences, its consciousness, its sense of self, is way more than just a bunch of genes.
So we're more than the ingredients in a recipe. We're the final dish.
I like that analogy. It shows that we're not just passive products of our genes. We're active, we interact with the world, and shape our own lives.
But if our choices can actually change how evolution happens, what does that mean for humans in the future?
That's thinking big picture. This book really makes you do that. We could talk about, like, purposely changing our genes, but even beyond that, the choices we make, both as individuals and together, are always affecting what drives evolution. Think about it. The environments we create, the technologies we develop, what we believe in, all these things play a part in evolution.
It's kind of amazing and scary to think we have that much influence.
It is. It reminds us that we're not just along for the ride in evolution. We're actively involved, and the choices we make now will affect generations to come.
Speaking of being connected, how does this extended phenotype idea change how we think about an organism and its environment?
It definitely blurs the lines. If a beaver's dam or a bird's nest shows its genes in action, does that mean the environment is just part of the organism? It makes you wonder where we draw the line.
It makes you look at nature documentaries differently.
Oh, totally. A bird's nest isn't just a nest anymore. It's the bird's genes interacting with the world.
So the environment is part of the organism's story, shaped by its genes and shaping those genes right back.
Exactly. It's this constant back and forth, a dance between genes, organisms, and the world they live in.
But if we zoom out even more, doesn't this selfish gene idea change how we think about competition in nature? It's not just about individual organisms fighting to survive, is it?
Right. It's a lot more complicated than that. The selfish gene isn't just about competition. It's also about coevolution. It's about how genes, organisms, and environments are constantly shaping each other.
So it's not a battle. It's more like a dance of adapting and changing. And humans, with how much it can change the environment, are definitely part of that dance.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another important thing. You often hear people say, there's no gene for intelligence, or there's no gene for musical talent. It's like they're trying to prove the gene-centric view wrong. But Dawkins says they're missing the point. It's not about finding that one gene that's in charge of a whole complex trait. It's about understanding how all the little differences in lots of genes, plus the environment, can lead to all sorts of individual differences.
So it's not about saying genes don't matter. It's about understanding that it's more complicated than just one gene for one thing.
Exactly. It's about appreciating how nature and nurture work together. Both are important in making us who we are.
Dawkins uses that rowing analogy again to show this, right?
You got it. He brings back that Oxford-Cambridge boat race to help us picture how genes work together, like rowers going for the same goal. Each rower adds to the boat's success, but it's the teamwork that really matters. Like genes working together to build and run an organism.
So even though we can't point to a single intelligence gene, it doesn't mean genes aren't a big part of our smarts.
Totally. Dawkins thinks this gene-centric view actually helps us understand how complex things like intelligence evolved. By looking at the genes themselves, we can see how these traits evolved and what pressures shaped them over time.
This has been, like, mind-blowing.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you think about who you are and your place in the world. If we're really just vehicles for these selfish genes, does that mean we don't have free will? Or are we just puppets controlled by our DNA?
The classic free will versus determinism question. It's been around forever. And while this gene-centric view might seem like it supports the idea that genes control everything, it's not that simple.
So we're not robots programmed by our genes.
Not exactly. Genes give us a starting point, but they don't decide every little thing we do. The environment's a big factor, too. It shapes how genes express themselves and affects the choices we make.
Like baking a cake. You have the ingredients, the genes, but the final cake depends on how you mix them, the oven temperature, the baking time, all that stuff.
Perfect analogy. We're not just passive products of our genes. We actively interact with the world and shape our own lives.
But this brings up another question. If our choices can change how evolution happens, what does that mean for the future of humanity?
Now you're thinking big, and that's what this book is all about. We could talk about, like, changing our genes on purpose. But even beyond that, the choices we make every day, by ourselves and as a society, are always affecting the forces that drive evolution. Think about it. The environments we create, the technology we develop, what we value, it all plays a role in this big evolutionary dance.
It's pretty amazing and a little scary to think we have that much power.
It is. It shows that we're not just along for the ride in evolution, we're active participants, and the choices we make now will affect generations to come.
So, wrapping up our deep dive into the Genetic Book of the Dead, what's the big picture? What do we take away from all this?
It's a book that really changes how you see things. It makes you think differently about yourself, nature, and what life is all about.
It's given us a lot to think about, that's for sure.
Definitely. And I think one of the most important things is that we're all part of this huge connected web of life that goes back billions of years. Understanding the selfish gene isn't about saying we're just robots or that our individual lives don't matter.
It's about understanding how complex life is, how all these forces shaped us, and the amazing potential we have to shape the future.
Exactly. And as you go about your day, Think about this. Every choice you make, every action you take is part of this incredible evolutionary dance. You're both a product of your genes. A&D, a shaper of the future. Embrace that complexity, that responsibility, and never stop exploring.